man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog.
I think the record should show that this is one of those spontaneous things that we always arrange whenever the president comes in to speak. Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
United States presidents are often completely misunderstood by the general public. Some are treated as heroes of democracy, such as Abraham Lincoln, while others are treated as evil traitors to our country, such as James Buchanan. However, in my opinion, there is simply one man who defines the principles of being misunderstood completely, and that person's name is Richard Milhous Nixon.
Nixon's back!
Nixon is often just seen as that person from the Watergate scandal, a corrupt, evil person, and he's normally ranked low on presidential rankings because of this. However, I have read more about Nixon and watched videos about Nixon, and I realized behind the Watergate scandal is a man who grew up in poverty and rose to the heights of the presidency only to fall victim of that exact same political system that brought him up in the first place. This is the story of Richard Milhous Nixon, the 37th President of the United States of America. Richard Nixon's own memoirs start with a simple message. I was born in a house my father built. And what powerful words those truly are. Richard Milhous Nixon was born on January 9th, 1913, in Yorba Linda, California, to a very poor Quaker family. Nixon grew up in poverty as the family farm went broke in 1922 and the family had very little money to work with. Nixon's parents couldn't really have been more different. Frank Nixon was an often stern, angry man who failed at a lot of things that he did, while his mother Hannah was calm and intelligent. Nixon often worked at the family store and suffered tragedy at a young age, losing his brothers Arthur and Harold. Both were pretty young. At school, Nixon was described as a very quiet student, yet a great public speaker. Nixon's financial struggles seemed to have followed him everywhere. In fact, Nixon had to turn down a Harvard degree because of the financial struggles he had at home. Nixon would eventually attend Whittier College, where he would graduate from in 1934 and go on to the Duke University School of Law. It's here we see where Nixon came from. He didn't come from a place of wealth. He came from a place in Southern California where he barely had any money on the table, living in a house his own father constructed. What built what we see from Richard Nixon also came from this, his skills in law and politics, but more importantly, his character. A man that would soon rise to the most powerful political position on earth, but still not fully escaping the tragedy and ridicule of his youth. After finishing law school at Duke in 1937, Nixon would start his law career. However, as World War II eventually reached the United States, Nixon would enter the United States Navy to serve in the war. Before that, in 1940, Nixon would marry Thelma Ryan, better known as Pat, who he would be with until her death in 1993, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Nixon would leave the Navy in 1946, and soon enough, he would get involved in politics with his election to the House of Representatives. In these years before the spotlight, many people simply saw Nixon as the little grocer's boy, a poor kid raised in circumstances out of his control. The foundation of a man who people now see as no more as a villain of that era. Now he will rise to national prominence. Nixon's rise up the political ladder began when he got elected to the House of Representatives in 1946, defeating New Deal Democrat Jerry Voorhis. While in the House of Representatives, Nixon served on the Heater Committee and the House Un-American Actives Committee. Perhaps Nixon's biggest accomplishment in the House of Representatives was leading an investigation into Alger Hiss, a former State Department official who was accused of Soviet espionage, which he would be convicted for. This single event made Nixon rise to national prominence, and Nixon would be re-elected in 1948. But he would resign from the House on November 30th, 1950, after being elected to the United States Senate. While in the Senate, Nixon took a firm stance against communism, had a friendly relationship with Joseph McCarthy, but notably distanced himself after the allegations against McCarthy came out. Nixon also criticized President Truman for his handling of Korea, calling it a war that we are not allowed to win. However, his time in the Senate would be cut short. In 1952, the Republicans nominated World War II General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Nixon was selected to be his running mate. During the campaign, Nixon was accused of maintaining an $18,000 fund from wealthy bankers. Following this, Eisenhower was pressured to drop Nixon from the ticket, but that wouldn't happen. In response to the allegations, Nixon delivered his famous Checkers speech, in which he detailed his current financial situation and said the one gift he got was a black and white cocker who he named Checkers. The speech caused Eisenhower not to kick Nixon off the ticket, and they won easily, defeating Democratic challenger Adlai Stevenson and making Nixon the 36th vice president in American history. Nixon was sworn in as VP in 1953 and got to work. Eisenhower gave Nixon more responsibilities as VP than previous VPs, with Nixon during cabinet meetings taking over while Eisenhower was absent. A 1953 tour was successful in creating goodwill for the United States in the Far East. However, the 1954 midterm saw Republicans lose control of the House and the Senate, despite Nixon campaigning for Republicans. On September 24, 1955, Eisenhower suffered a serious heart attack. Even though the 25th Amendment had been proposed, Nixon carried out Eisenhower's duties for 6 weeks, while Eisenhower was unable to perform them. During the 1956 campaign, many of Eisenhower's own aides wanted to dump Nixon, but Eisenhower didn't, and they would easily win re-election. Nixon's second term began with him taking a trip to Africa, and when getting back, he got the Civil Rights Act of 1957 through Congress. In April of 1958, Nixon went on a trip to South America, where he and Pat got spit on by anti-Americans, and Nixon would call it proof they were controlled by a communist conspiracy. In 1959, Eisenhower would get Nixon to visit the USSR for the opening of the American National Exhibit. Nixon was there with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, in which they stopped at an American kitchen and had an infamous kitchen debate. It was pretty famous. Nixon would get the Republican nomination for president in 1960 despite a draft Rockefeller movement, and he seemed to be on his way straight to the presidency. Nixon's political rise from the House to the Senate to the vice presidency was in a span of less than a decade, from his first election to the House of Representatives in 1946 to his election as vice president in 1952. The lessons Nixon had learned in his youth came in handy, as he was now a quick rising person on the political ladder, and it seemed that he was just about to reach the presidency. However, Nixon's political career would seem to fall as fast as it had rose, and in just a few years it would seem that his entire political career was over. Nixon won the nomination and would choose Henry Cabot Lodge, third U.S. ambassador to the UN, as his running mate. Nixon would end up facing John F. Kennedy, who in terms of upbringing was the exact total opposite of Nixon. While Nixon grew up in poverty, having to fight to survive, Kennedy was blessed with the extreme wealth of the Kennedy family, growing up as fortunate as most people could ever be. He was facing off against him as well as then Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson, who was Kennedy's running mate. Nixon seemed to be leading at first, but if there was one thing Kennedy had and Nixon did it was charisma. Kennedy was a charisma machine, being able to attract voters like a magnet, and started to catch up to Nixon. A bad look for Nixon came when Dwight Eisenhower was at a press conference and asked about what role Nixon had played in the administration, where he proceeded to say,
Could give us an example of a major idea of his that you had adopted in that role as the decider and final.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
Because
though Eisenhower didn't want to hurt Nixon, it sure did. However, the main thing that defined the campaign was the presidential debates. It was the first ever presidential debates ever, and they were broadcasted on TV and radio. While people on the radio thought Nixon won the debate, people on TV thought Kennedy won the debate. To people watching on TV, Kennedy seemed to be better prepared and better looking, while Nixon was sweating during the debate. The election took place on November 8th, and it was extremely close. But in the end, John F. Kennedy won the election, defeating Richard Nixon. Soon after the election, it was alleged that there was voter fraud, specifically in Texas and Illinois. However, Nixon would concede the election, and would also be the one to certify the election results due to him being the vice president at the time. On January 20th, 1961, instead of Richard Nixon, it was John Kennedy, a rich kid from Massachusetts, being sworn in as president-elect of the United States, while Nixon watched on, sitting next to Vice President-elect Lyndon Johnson. Nixon left the vice presidency that same day, probably wondering that could have been him being sworn up there. But Nixon wouldn't wait long to run again. On September 27th, 1961, Nixon announced his candidacy for governor of California and would win the Republican nomination for it. He would face off against Pat Brown for the general. During the campaign, Nixon accused Brown of being weak on the threat of communism and crime, which got Nixon an early lead in the polls. However, Brown would catch up and would beat Nixon in the election. After this, Nixon had a press conference, which he said at it would be his last.
A lot of fun. A lot of fun. You've had an opportunity to attack me, and I think I've given as good as I've taken. Press conference.
Just like that, Richard Milhous Nixon was now a failed presidential candidate and a failed gubernatorial candidate, and was now back to simple private life. During this inactive period from 1962 to 1968, he was actually in the city of Dallas the day before President Kennedy was assassinated, and when Kennedy was assassinated on the date of November 22nd, 1963, Nixon was in mourning. Nixon's opponent in California, Pat Brown, wouldn't serve that long. In the California gubernatorial next, the gubernatorial of 1966, he would lose to Ronald Reagan, meaning that Pat Brown is the only human being on the planet to win against the future president and lose against another future president, but not for the office of the presidency. By this time, his political career was basically over. In 1960, Nixon was the second most powerful man in America, the vice president under a very popular Eisenhower, and seemed to be on the way to the presidency. And by 1962, his political career seemed to be over, as he had lost a California gubernatorial and, more importantly, the presidential election against John F. Kennedy. However, after Kennedy was assassinated and LBJ took office, he won his own massive landslide in 1964. But his popularity slowly began to decline due to the escalation of the Vietnam War, and the 1966 midterms were not good for Democrats. Nixon, in 1968, decided to give it one more shot, and this last shot at the presidency might be the greatest political comeback in the history of American presidential politics. The year is 1968. The president is Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he isn't all that popular. The war in Vietnam was escalating quickly, and this caused civil unrest to outbreak all across the entire nation. Nevertheless, Lyndon Johnson decided that he would run for a second full term as president, but due to his unpopularity, people wanted to dump Johnson and not have him as the nominee, and those people nominated Senator Eugene McCarthy. In the Democratic New Hampshire primary, Johnson did end up winning, but McCarthy came in a close second, showing that Johnson could very well be challenged. Things were made even worse when the wildly popular Robert F. Kennedy, a senator from New York, the former Attorney General, and the brother of deceased President John F. Kennedy, announced that he would also run for the presidency of the United States. Johnson, who had been declining in health for years, officially announced on March 31st, 1968, that he would not seek the nomination of his party for the presidency of the United States, and he gave his support to his vice president, Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey would officially announce his candidacy for the President of the United States on April 27, 1968. However, polls quickly showed that Kennedy was starting to catch up, and during this period, civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, only fueling the fire more on the issue of civil unrest. After a few more primaries, Kennedy and McCarthy vigorously campaigned in the California primaries. However, tragedy would strike on June 5, 1968, as Robert Kennedy was assassinated, only fueling the fire more on the issue of civil unrest and adding more to the chaos of the Democratic primaries. The convention would be held in Chicago, Illinois, but things outside were crazy as anti-war protests quickly got violent as the Chicago police had to intervene, causing violence to just ensue right outside the building. As for the primary itself, Humphrey easily won on the first ballot, defeating Eugene McCarthy as well as Senator from South Dakota, George McGovern. As Humphrey's running mate, Maine Senator Edmund Muskie was selected. Moving over to the Republican side, Richard Nixon would officially announce his candidacy for the presidency of the United States on February 1st, 1968. At first, his main competitor was George Romney, the governor of Michigan, and yes, he is the father of 2012 Republican candidate Mitt Romney. However, after saying stuff about the Vietnam War and that he had been quote-unquote brainwashed, he dropped significantly in the polls and would pull out of the race entirely. Nixon would win a massive victory in the New Hampshire primaries. However, anti-Nixon supporters would ride in New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who would actually beat Nixon in the Massachusetts primary. However, in spring of that year, California Governor Ronald Reagan announced his own candidacy for the presidency, and soon enough, he would become Nixon's primary competitor. However, despite the movements from Ronald Reagan and Nelson Rockefeller, Nixon would go on to win the nomination for president. However, he would come in second place in terms of the popular vote, as Ronald Reagan actually got more votes in the popular vote than Nixon. At the convention, Spiro Agnew, the governor of the state of Maryland, was selected to be Nixon's running mate. However, we're not done with candidates, as former Alabama Governor George Wallace announced his candidacy for the American Independent Party as a pro-segregationist candidate, and would be the primary third-party candidate in the race. And with this, the general election was on. During the campaign itself, Nixon used what he called the Southern Strategy to get support of white Southerners who were normally voted Democrat but did not support Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey's support of civil rights, and this would also pull votes away from George Wallace. Also, during the campaign, Nixon would use the phrase law and order, using the examples of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy as examples of the civil unrest happening in the nation, that he would bring law and order to the nation. Humphrey, meanwhile, campaigned on continuing LBJ's Great Society program as well as the war on poverty. However, he was behind Nixon by double digits in the polls. In October, with Wallace rising in the polls, Humphrey would actually start to distance himself from the Johnson administration and actually went to attack LBJ on his handling of the Vietnam War. Also, there was no presidential debate, mainly because Nixon was scared of having another performance like he did in 1960 and losing the lead that he had in the polls to Hubert Humphrey. The day of November 5th, 1968 came. Americans held their breath to see who would become the 37th President of the United States. People went to the voting booths, and America said Nixon would be their next president. Nixon won the election, securing 301 electoral college votes to Hubert Humphrey's 191 and Wallace's 46. However, the popular vote was actually much closer, with Nixon getting 43.4% of the popular vote compared to Humphrey's 42.7 and Wallace's 13.5. On January 20th, 1969, after having lost the election against John F. Kennedy, after losing the gubernatorial election against Pat Brown, and all the other events that had happened in his life, Nixon was inaugurated at the Capitol as the 37th President of the United States of America. He gave his inauguration address, and after this, the Nixon era of the White House would begin. And now it's time to deep dive into Richard Nixon's time as the President of the United States, from 1969 up and through 1974. Richard Nixon had just been elected the 37th President of the United States of America, and now during Nixon's first term, he would get a lot of stuff done that would fundamentally change the United States of America as a whole. When Nixon took office as president, the Vietnam War had been raging for years. Inflation was at 4.7%, the highest it had ever been since the Korean War back in the 1950s. And because of these things, Nixon had to take action immediately. In terms of the Vietnam War, Nixon knew when he got in office that it needed to be end quickly. In mid-1969, Nixon had diplomatic meetings with North Vietnam to find a peaceful solution to the war. However, these negotiations quickly fell apart. In July of that year, Nixon visited South Vietnam to meet with military commanders as well as just the nation in general to meet with soldiers who were currently stationed in South Vietnam. In March of 1970, Nixon officially announced his war efforts in Laos and Cambodia, which is something that people today are, let's just say something that people heavily criticize Nixon for today. This was met with protest, which led to the Ohio State National Guard killing 4 students at Kent State University, and this event would become known as the Kent State Massacre. During Nixon's first presidential term from 1969 up until 1973, around 20,000 United States troops died, and that's not even including, the civilian deaths that also took place during that period of time. In the Latin America Caribbean region, Nixon stepped up covert operations against Cuba's dictator Fidel Castro, and the Soviets were worried that Nixon would break the pact signed by John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets informed Nixon about it, and Nixon knew, and Nixon was fully aware about this. One of Nixon's biggest accomplishments during his first term was the opening of China. Henry Kissinger, who at the time was Nixon's national security advisor and is a well-known future Secretary of State, was the main person advising in Chinese relations. In February of 1972, Nixon visited communist China and met with China's notorious dictator and communist leader Mao Zedong, in which they met with Mao to discuss issues between them, in which Mao is said to have said about Nixon that he was very impressed with Nixon's forthrightness, but was very suspicious about Henry Kissinger. During this visit to China, it changed the relationship between the U.S. and China, as Nixon was there and he saw what life was really like in China and visited landmarks in China such as the Great Wall of China. The people over in the Soviet Union weren't particularly happy about a change in relationship, arguably for the better, between the United States and China. Speaking of the Soviets, Nixon would visit the Soviet Union later in 1972, meeting with the Soviet premier at the time, Leonid Abramovich. And during Nixon's second term, they had negotiations in Washington that eventually led to increased trade between the two countries, arms control treaties, and the first test limitation acts ever with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And all this would lead to better relations between the United States and the Soviet Union that we hadn't really ever seen before. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Nixon believed Israel should definitely make peace with its Arab neighbors, and which, as we can see today, it really just hasn't. American Jews would not actually support Nixon for re-election despite how much Nixon tried, and overall the whole Middle Eastern issue that Nixon had to deal with wouldn't be as prevalent, especially in his first term in office. On domestic policies, the economy wasn't improving the most during 1970, causing the midterms that year to not be the best for Republicans, and with those elections being more lackluster than anything. However, a big thing concerning the economy was the Nixon shock. On August 15th, 1971, Nixon announced that the United States dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. This was mainly because, due to a large amount of paper money being printed, especially during the Vietnam War that hadn't been ended, many countries decided that they were going to trade in this paper money for gold, and the United States did not have the amount of gold, well, that would sustain all these transactions. So Nixon took the United States off the gold standard, and today, the fact that Nixon took the United States off the gold standard is considered definitely one of Nixon's many mistakes during his time in office. By 1972, the economy was starting to recover in a good favor, which would mean that it would definitely help Nixon in his re-election bid in 1972. On the environment, Nixon was the president who created the Environmental Protection Agency, signed the Clean Air Act of 1970, and supported the National Environmental Policy Act. On the issue of civil rights, Nixon saw the real first large integration of public schools in the South between white children and African American children. On space policy, Nixon was the president at the time when astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in July of 1969. However, he didn't fund NASA as much as before, as also during his term, the Apollo program ended. That same year that it ended in 1972, Nixon approved a 5-year cooperation program between the Soviet space program and NASA to work together on things. Now, there's a lot more about Richard Nixon that I didn't get to, and I sure as heck did not explain everything he did in his first term. He did a lot more, and these were pretty oversimplified versions of the events. However, his approval rating during his first term had an average of 55%, which isn't horrible, especially for a post-World War II president. Also, Nixon never controlled Congress for his whole presidency. Even with all these factors he did in his landslide victory coming up, he's never controlled Congress. Nixon would easily get renominated by the Republicans in 1972. As for the Democrats, they had people such as George Wallace, former governor of Alabama, George McGovern, senator from South Dakota, and Hubert Humphrey, the 1968 Democratic nominee and the former vice president. George Wallace got shot during his own campaign and would eventually survive, and eventually the Democrats would pick George McGovern as his running mate, picking Missouri Senator Thomas Eagleton. However, it was revealed that Eagleton went through shock therapy, and McGovern didn't handle the situation very well, and Eagleton would end up leaving the ticket and was replaced with Sergeant Shriver, the U.S. ambassador to France. McGovern didn't run a very good campaign at all, and the wildly popular Richard Nixon seemed to be on his way to landslide victory. In the end, Nixon did more than a landslide. He did a mega landslide, winning 520 electoral college votes to McGovern's 17, and those 17 electoral votes came from the states of Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, while Nixon won everything else. Except for one single electoral vote in the state of Virginia, which voted for a Libertarian Party candidate. This was the first election they ran a candidate, John Hosmer's. On January 20th, 1973, months after massive landslide victory, Richard Nixon was inaugurated again for his second term as the 37th President of the United States, and Nixon seemed to be on top of the world. The little grocer's boy from from Yorba Linda, California, was seemingly unstoppable, an unstoppable political force and a wildly popular president. However, the political system that brought Nixon up in the first place would be the same one to bring him down, and Nixon would go down as having one of the biggest political fall-offs in the history of American politics. It's January 1973. Richard Nixon was on top of the world. Just months after, up until that point, one of the largest landslides in the history of American politics, he was on top of the world, and it seemed that nothing could bring him down. As he begins his second term, things start normal, but soon enough they will devolve into the most infamous political scandal in the history of the country. But before we get to that, let's discuss some elements of his second term that don't involve that particular scandal. Nixon's biggest accomplishment in the second term was the end of direct U.S. involvement in Vietnam. In January of 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, which ended the direct U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam, and that same month, the draft was ended for the war. This shows that even though in the beginning of his presidency, Nixon initially tried to escalate it with the wars in Laos and Cambodia, he would eventually, near the end of his presidency, de-escalate the war by officially ending direct U.S. involvement. However, in October of 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out in the Middle East between Arab nations and the State of Israel, and Nixon, because of this, sent immediate aid and airlift military supplies to the State of Israel. Because of Nixon's support for Israel, Arab nations embargoed the United States, leading to what people now know today as the 1973 oil crisis, which caused fuel shortages and this temporary economic crisis. From this point onwards, the Nixon administration as a whole would start going downhill as scandal began to plague the administration. And this would of course start with a resignation. However, said resignation would not be from that of President Nixon. It would be that of his vice president, Spiro Agnew. Agnew had been Nixon's vice president since when Nixon took office in 1969, but there would end up being a scandal revealed when he was Maryland governor that Agnew had accepted cash payoffs and kickbacks. In August of 1973, U.S. Attorney John Beale led an investigation against Agnew, in which Agnew defended his innocence. In the end, however, Agnew eventually pleaded no contest and had to resign because of it. Agnew would officially resign from the vice presidency on October 10th, 1973, making him the second vice president in American history to resign from their office, the first one being John C. Calhoun, all the way back in 1832. Now, for any other administration, like with Andrew Jackson's, which we just mentioned, with John C. Calhoun, the vice president couldn't be replaced. However, since the 25th Amendment to the Constitution had been passed, Nixon could select a new vice president, and the person he selected was House Minority Whip Gerald R. Ford, who would be approved and become the next vice president of the United States. Now, in basically any other administration, this would have been their biggest scandal. However, for the Nixon administration, that title doesn't go to Spiro Agnews. It of course goes to the infamous Watergate scandal. Now, you people watching this probably already know the broad details. There was a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, Nixon tried to cover it up, Nixon resigns, blah blah blah. But I'm going to give you a more detailed version so you guys get the most information on the scandal and the full story of the Watergate scandal. On June 17th, 1972, during Nixon's re-election campaign that same year, 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington, D.C. Out of the 5 men who broke into the hotel, 4 of them had ties with the CIA, and the one who didn't, James McCord, had also worked for not only just the CIA, but also the FBI. After the break-in, Nixon and his administration would immediately deny having any involvement in what they called this stupid break-in, and Nixon will meet with his White House Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, in which he said that Nixon wanted the CIA as well as the FBI to limit their investigation into the scandal itself, and this tape would become infamously known as the smoking gun tape. It is also said that hush money was paid to the burglars and their families to encourage them to keep quiet on the break-in itself. Meanwhile, 2 reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, continued to investigate the scandal, with somebody named Deep Throat, who's confirmed to be Mark Fell, an FBI Associate Director, help the reporters with their investigations. The burglars themselves would eventually have their trial, and most of them would actually plead guilty, with the exception of McCord. But in the end of the trial, all 5 of the people would be found guilty of the crime of breaking into the Watergate Hotel. During this period also, John Dean, the White House counsel, testified that Nixon had covered up his involvement in the scandal, there was hush money being paid to the burglars and their families, and an obstruction of justice was going on. The Watergate Senate Committee would eventually be set up, with Sam Erwin as its chair, and the person to ask the infamous question of what does the president know and when did he know it was Tennessee Senator Howard Baker, and they would get witnesses of the scandal and people in the scandal to testify about it. It was soon revealed that Nixon actually recorded every message that happened in the Oval Office. However, it is also said that people like Lyndon B. Johnson did the exact same thing. On the infamous day of October 20th, 1973, Nixon wanted his Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, and Richardson would refuse entirely and resigned from his office. As well did this Deputy Attorney General William Russell. It took until Solicitor General Robert Bork to get Cox fired, and this day would infamously go down as the Saturday Night Massacre. Soon enough, the Supreme Court simply had enough and got involved in the case U.S. v. Nixon. In an 8-0 ruling, it was said that Nixon had to surrender the tapes he had, which confirmed in this trial that judicial authority prevailed over the president in this situation. After looking through the tapes, on August 5th, the smoking gun tape would be released, and before that, in July, articles of impeachment were introduced in the House of Representatives to impeach Nixon, and Republican leaders informed Richard Nixon that he would most likely be impeached in the House and most likely be convicted in the Senate. Then came one of the most infamous moments in the history of not only Richard Nixon, but the history of presidential politics. On the date of August 8th, 1974, Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office for the 37th time to announce that he would be resigning from the office of President of the United States effective tomorrow, and that Vice President Gerald Ford would be the next President of the United States. Even to this very day, as I say this in the year of 2026, Richard Nixon is still the only president in the history of the United States to have left the presidency midway through his term, not in the case of death. The very next day, on August 9th, 1974, Nixon would officially resign from the presidency and leave the Oval Office in the presidential helicopter, and Gerald R. Ford was sworn in as the 38th president in the history of the United States. Just about a year earlier, Nixon had seemed unstoppable. In 1974, he had won one of the largest political and electoral landslides in the history of the United States. Nixon seemed on top of the world, and that nothing could bring him down. However, the political system brought him down, and this time, Nixon's political career was officially over, and Nixon's political career would forever now be tainted with the outcry from the Watergate scandal, in which he had involvement in. And now, and even to this day, many people only know Nixon for his flaws at the Watergate scandal, and not the successes in his political career and his presidency. However, even though Richard Nixon's career had come to an official end, Nixon still had around another 20-ish years left in his life. So let's take a look at Richard Nixon's post-presidency, from his resignation in 1974 up through his death in 1994. After Nixon left the White House, Nixon would return home in his home in California, in which he would just go back to a private life following the turmoil of the Watergate scandal. And a month later, President Gerald Ford would pardon Nixon, primarily due to the fact that the Nixon-Watergate scandal was taking up literally all his time, and he had a struggling economy, Vietnam, and the fallout from Vietnam, and a bunch of other issues to worry with. However, just 2 months after Nixon's resignation, he almost came to an end. He was admitted to Memorial Hospital in Long Beach, California, and it was revealed that he actually had a blood clot in his right leg. He would eventually undergo surgery, which would remove clots, also in his abdomen and left leg. After it, Nixon would not be in good condition and could have died. However, he would survive and leave the hospital on November 23rd, 1974. Just think about it, that only 2 months after Nixon resigned, he almost died. However, Nixon would begin to come back into the public spotlight, starting with his memoirs, which he completed in 1978, and earned him an estimated $2 million, $2 million whole dollars. And he also had an interview with British journalist David Frost, and the interview went, well, as good as you think it went.
And do something illegal.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
By definition.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, even with the fallout from the Watergate scandal, Nixon would still travel to continents like Asia, Europe, Africa, and countries like that to talk foreign policy. And he would also advise presidents such as Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton on foreign policy as well as other issues. Nixon also wrote a bunch of books. Besides from his memoirs, there is In the Arena, Real Peace, and No More Vietnams, and a lot more books. Nixon's post-presidency as a whole is one of the most interesting in American history. He would have countless interviews with people like David Frost, like we mentioned earlier, as well as Frank Gannon, and had a public image comeback And it was a little interesting. Just in 1974, he was seen as the Watergate guy, and he had a little bit of a resurgence. Sure, even to this day, Watergate still torments him, and it's the main thing that people talk about. But he still had other policies that a lot of people like. He would end up becoming this respected elder statesman that had his reputation affected him in a mostly positive way. But soon enough, tragedy in his life would strike. On June 22nd, 1993, Pat Nixon, Nixon's wife of 53 years, passed away, and Nixon was absolutely devastated. At the funeral, he was very noticeably openly sobbing, and because could have been his wife, been by his side for 53 whole years, and now she was dead. And Nixon would live the rest of his life, well, for the most part, out of the spotlight, and would be broken for the rest of his life, practically. But soon our story will come to an end. On April 22nd, 1994, the man who is known as the Watergate Man, the man who had influenced politics for many years, the little grocer's boy from Yorba Linda, California, died from a sudden stroke in New York City. He was 81 years old. Nixon's funeral would be held 5 days later on April 27th. And just like that, Richard Milhous Nixon was gone. Now, the life of Richard Nixon has officially come to an end. This man even today still has so much influence on American politics. But going back to the present day, how did this single man really change politics forever? Richard Milhous Nixon has left an imprint on American history that a lot of other presidents really just haven't. People point out the fact that he made Americans lose trust in the presidency, but Richard Nixon's story is so much more than just the Watergate scandal. The little kid from Southern California who barely had any money, who clawed his way up the political ladder to reach the vice presidency, to end up like it was the end of everything and that his political career was over, just for him to come back and become the most powerful man on earth, only to fall in one of the biggest political falls in the history of American politics, for something that would overshadow his whole career. For the rest of time, Richard Nixon will remain as one of the most controversial presidents in American history, with some people praising his accomplishments and others only looking at the Watergate scandal. A legacy unlike any other legacy in American history. This former representative, senator, former vice president, and president of the United States has left an imprint on American history that still stands, even to this day. This is the Centuries Historian signing off. And thanks for watching. And as always, make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for watching.